in the winter gloom of Nizhny Novgorod, Russia's fifth-largest city, where the Volga River freezes solid and the snow falls like ash from a darkening sky, there existed a man who lived between two worlds. The world of the living knew him as a brilliant scholar, a linguist who spoke 13 languages, a historian whose knowledge of Celtic folklore was unmatched in all of Russia. But in the other world, the world of the dead, he was something else entirely. They would come to call him the Lord of the Mummies, though that name would only emerge after November 2011, when police knocked on the door of a cramped apartment and discovered what lay within. The story begins decades earlier, on September 1, 1966, when Anatoly Moskvin entered the world in the city, then known as Gorky, in the heart of Soviet Russia. Born to Yuri Fedorovich and Elvira Alexandrovna, ordinary parents living ordinary Soviet lives, young Anatoly seemed destined for a different fate from the very beginning. While other children played in dusty courtyards and chased each other through the gray apartment blocks that characterized Soviet architecture, Anatoly buried himself in books. His parents described him as meek, intelligent, profoundly socially awkward, a boy who seemed more comfortable with the written word than with human voices. But something changed when Anatoly reached 8 or 9 years of age. The quiet, studious boy began having violent outbursts, sudden explosions of rage directed at his parents. They couldn't understand what had transformed their gentle child into someone capable of such anger. Years later, Moskvin would admit to investigators that he had been raped by an unknown man during this period of his childhood. His parents never knew. They simply backed away, giving him space, leaving him more isolated than ever before. This distance between Anatoly and his family would stretch across the remainder of their lives together, a chasm that would never truly close even when they shared the same cramped apartment for decades. As a schoolboy in Gorky, young Moskvin began wandering through cemeteries with his friends. The Krasnaya Etna Cemetery in the Leninsky district became his favorite haunt, a place where the living rarely ventured and the dead lay silent beneath carved stones and faded flowers. While other boys feared these places, avoided them after dark, whispered stories of ghosts and ghouls, Anatoly felt drawn to them. There was peace among the graves, a quietness that the chaotic world of the living could never provide. He would walk between the rows of headstones, reading names and dates, calculating how long each person had lived, wondering what their final moments had been like. Then came the incident that would define everything that followed, the moment that planted seeds in soil already made fertile by trauma and isolation. Moskvin was 13 years old, walking home from school through the gray streets of his city, when he encountered a funeral procession. It was 1979, and the procession was for an 11-year-old girl named Natasha Petrova. A group of men in black suits, moving like shadows through the winter streets, carrying a small coffin that seemed impossibly light. They saw the boy watching, and something in them decided he should participate. Perhaps they thought it would be meaningful, perhaps they were drunk on vodka and grief, perhaps they simply didn't care. They grabbed young Anatoly by the arms and dragged him toward the coffin. He would later write about this moment in an article for a local newspaper, describing how an adult pushed his face down toward the waxy forehead of the girl in her embroidered cap. There was nothing he could do but kiss her cold skin as ordered. The dead girl's lips were pale, her skin the color of old candles, her eyes closed as if in sleep, though everyone knew she would never wake. Then Natasha's mother, lost in the madness of grief, placed a wedding ring on Moskvin's finger. She placed another matching ring on her dead daughter's finger. In that moment, in some twisted ceremony born of sorrow and desperation, they were married, a 13-year-old boy and a corpse in a coffin. The men in black suits watched. No one stopped it. No one spoke against it. This was how things were sometimes in Soviet Russia, where grief could manifest in ways the rational mind refused to acknowledge. Moskvin would later claim that this forced marriage, this kiss planted on dead flesh, was what sparked his lifelong obsession with the deceased, Whether this was true or simply a narrative he constructed to explain the inexplicable, no one could say for certain. But from that day forward, death became more than just an abstract concept for young Anatoly. It became personal. It became intimate. It became the lens through which he would view the entire world. He threw himself into his studies with an intensity that bordered on mania. Where other students struggled with a single foreign language, Moskvin mastered 13. Russian, English, French, German, Spanish, Portuguese, Finnish, Hindi, Arabic, Chinese, and several Celtic languages including Welsh and Gaelic. He devoured books on history, particularly Celtic history and folklore, becoming fascinated with cultures that viewed death not as an ending but as a transformation, a passage to another state of being. The ancient Celts believed the boundary between life and death was permeable, that the dead could speak to the living, that with the right rituals and knowledge, one might even bring someone back from beyond the veil. After graduating from Moscow State University with degrees in philology and history, Moskvin became known in academic circles as something between a genius and an eccentric. His papers were published in respected journals. He translated obscure medieval texts from Celtic languages into Russian. He became a lecturer at the Institute of Foreign Languages, teaching students about dead civilizations and forgotten tongues. His personal library grew to over 60,000 books and documents, stacks of them filling every corner of his room, creating narrow pathways between towers of knowledge that threatened to topple at any moment. But Moskvin's true passion, his real calling, lay not in dusty academic texts but in the cemeteries themselves. In 2005, a fellow academic named Oleg Ryabov commissioned him to document every grave in over 700 cemeteries across the Nizhny Novgorod region. For most people, this would have been a grim, exhausting task, something to be completed as quickly as possible and then forgotten. For Moskvin, it was paradise. Over the next 2 years, he walked through 752 cemeteries, sometimes covering 30 kilometers in a single day. He slept in haystacks when night fell, in abandoned buildings, even in coffins when he found them empty and waiting for their designated occupants. He drank rainwater. He took detailed notes on every grave marker, every inscription, every date of birth and death. His editor at Necrologies, the weekly newspaper dedicated to obituaries and cemetery documentation, called his work unique and priceless. Moskvin himself declared that no one in the city knew the cemeteries better than he did. This wasn't arrogance but simple truth. He had walked every path, documented every grave, memorized the layout of entire burial grounds. He created video documentaries of his walks, calling them Great Walks Around Cemeteries, and What the Dead Said. In these videos, he would narrate as he moved between graves, speaking about the lives of those buried there, reconstructing their stories from the fragments left behind on stone markers. But something was changing in Moskvin during these long years among the dead. His fascination was deepening into something darker, something that went beyond mere academic interest. He began sleeping on top of graves, not just for convenience when night caught him far from home, but deliberately, choosing specific graves of young girls who had died years or even decades earlier. He claimed that while lying on these graves, he experienced contact with the spirits of the dead children. They spoke to him, he said. They told him they were lonely in the cold earth. They asked him to bring them home, to give them warmth and companionship, to rescue them from the eternal darkness of the grave. Whether Moskvin truly believed he was hearing these voices, or whether this was a delusion born of untreated mental illness, no one would ever know for certain. But he began to act on what he believed these voices were telling him. Sometime around 2009, he opened his first grave. The exact date is uncertain, lost to the shadows of memory and madness, but families in the Nizhny Novgorod region began noticing something wrong. Graves that had been undisturbed for years suddenly showed signs of desecration, earth displaced, coffins opened, bodies missing. At first, people blamed vandals, teenagers playing sick jokes. Some suspected black magic practitioners or members of extremist groups. Few could have imagined the truth. Moskvin developed a methodology, a system for his excavations that combined his academic knowledge with a careful attention to avoiding detection. He would read obituaries in local newspapers, studying them like sacred texts. When he found an obituary for a girl between the ages of 3 and 15 who had died years earlier, he would visit her grave. He would lie on the cold earth and wait for contact, for some sign that this particular girl wanted to be rescued. Most of the time, he claimed, there was no contact and he would move on. But sometimes, he said, the girl would speak to him through the darkness, through the earth itself, begging to be taken home. Under cover of night, when the cemeteries were empty and the city slept, Moskvin would return with tools: a shovel to move the earth, gloves to protect his hands, plastic bags to carry what he needed. He worked quietly, methodically, excavating the graves with the same careful attention he applied to his academic research. When he reached the coffin, often rotted and collapsed from years underground, he would open it to find the body inside. Some had been embalmed, their features partially preserved by chemicals and cold earth. Others had decomposed more severely, leaving little but bones and dried tissue. But to Moskvin, they were all beautiful. They were all children who needed rescue, who needed love, who needed someone to care for them in a way their parents had not by abandoning them to the cold ground. He couldn't bring the bodies home immediately. That would be too risky, too obvious. Instead, he developed a preservation technique based on his research into ancient mummification practices. He would treat the bodies with a mixture of salt and baking soda, the same compounds used by ancient cultures to preserve their dead. Then he would hide the body in a secure location near the cemetery, often in old mausoleums or abandoned buildings, places where no one would look and where the dry air would aid in the desiccation process. He would visit regularly, checking on the progress, waiting for the body to dry completely. This could take months, sometimes even longer, but Moskvin was patient. He had learned patience from years of academic research, from countless hours sitting in libraries and archives. Once a body was fully mummified, dried to the point where decomposition had essentially stopped, Moskvin would carry it home. This was perhaps the most dangerous part of his operation, the moment when he was most vulnerable to discovery. He would wrap the body carefully in black plastic bags, place it in a backpack or large duffel bag, and walk through the streets of Nizhny Novgorod with his prize. Neighbors would sometimes see him with these heavy bags, but no one questioned him. He was the quiet academic, the eccentric professor who collected strange things. If his bags were heavy, well, probably they were full of books. Moskvin was always carrying books. Back in his apartment, the small 3-room space he shared with his parents, Moskvin would begin the transformation. The mummified bodies were shrunken, withered, their features collapsed and distorted by the loss of moisture. They looked like something from a nightmare, dried husks that barely resembled the children they had once been. But Moskvin saw potential where others would have seen only horror. He believed that these physical forms were temporary, that eventually science or perhaps magic would advance to the point where he could bring these girls back to life. When that day came, he wanted them to have bodies they could be comfortable in, bodies that looked and felt normal rather than the decayed remains in which they had been buried. He wrapped their limbs in strips of cloth, carefully winding the fabric around shrunken arms and legs to give them more normal proportions. He stuffed the body cavities with rags and padding, trying to restore the fullness that dehydration had stolen. Over their collapsed faces, he applied masks made of wax, carefully sculpted and painted to create the illusion of living flesh. He decorated these masks with nail polish, adding color to lips and cheeks, trying to make them look like the healthy children they had been before death claimed them. Then came the clothing, bright-colored dresses and outfits that he bought or made himself, the kind of cheerful garments that young girls wear to birthday parties and family gatherings. He added wigs of human or synthetic hair, styled to look fashionable and cared for. The final touch was perhaps the most disturbing. Moskvin inserted button eyes into the faces of some of his creations, sewing them in place where the original eyes had long since decomposed. He did this, he later explained to investigators, so that the girls could watch television with him, so they could see the cartoons and fairy tales he played for them. In his mind, these were not corpses but resurrected children, girls he had saved from loneliness and darkness, daughters who needed his care and attention. His parents, Elvira and Yuri, lived in the same apartment, sharing the space with their son and his ever-growing collection of what they believed were elaborate life-sized dolls. They had one in their own room, seated in a corner like an oversized toy. They had noticed the dolls appearing over the years, strange creations that their adult son seemed to be making or collecting. They thought it was odd, certainly, but Anatoly had always been odd. He was brilliant, yes, but brilliance often came with eccentricity. They didn't question too deeply. They didn't want to invade his privacy or make him uncomfortable. And so they simply accepted that their middle-aged son, who had never married or even dated, who had no interest in alcohol or tobacco, who lived like a monk among his books, was now also creating or collecting these strange dolls. There was a smell in the apartment, something sweet and rotten that never quite went away no matter how much they cleaned or aired out the rooms. Elvira mentioned it to her son more than once. Anatoly would smile and explain that it was from his old books, from the decay of ancient paper and leather bindings, from the natural decomposition of organic materials that happens in any large library. His mother accepted this explanation, though the smell troubled her. The neighbors in their building complained about it too, that sickly sweet odor that seemed to seep through the walls and into the stairwell. But in a Russian apartment block, strange smells were not uncommon. Something was always rotting in someone's apartment, always some problem with plumbing or ventilation. People learned to ignore it. Moskvin's routine with his dolls became almost domestic in its normalcy, at least from his perspective. He would celebrate their birthdays, marking the dates from their grave markers, buying small cakes and presents. He would read to them from books in his massive library, sharing stories in multiple languages. He would play music for them, having embedded music boxes inside the chest cavities of several bodies, so that when he moved or touched them, they would produce sound, creating the illusion of response and life. He would sit them in front of the television and watch cartoons with them, fairy tales and animated films, the kind of content that children would enjoy. In his mind, he was being a good father, providing for his daughters in ways their biological parents had not. He even created a hierarchy among them, designating favorites and relegating others to less prominent positions. Some of the dolls were kept in his room where he could see them constantly. Others were placed in common areas of the apartment. And some, the ones he liked least or found less appealing, were banished to the garage, sentenced to darkness and isolation. He gave them names, sometimes their original names from their gravestones, sometimes new names of his own choosing. He developed personalities for them, entire backstories and characteristics. In the twisted reality he had constructed, they were a family. But while Moskvin lived in this delusion, families across the Nizhny Novgorod region were suffering. Graves continued to be desecrated, more bodies went missing. Parents who had buried children years or even decades earlier would visit the cemetery only to find the graves disturbed, the earth displaced, the coffins empty. The grief and horror of these discoveries was immeasurable. To lose a child once was unbearable. To lose them again, to have their resting place violated and their body stolen, was a trauma beyond words. Police received report after report, dozens then hundreds of desecrated graves, but they had few leads and no clear suspects. In 2011, after a terrorist attack at Domodedovo Airport in Moscow, investigators began looking into possible connection to extremist groups in the Nizhny Novgorod region. This led them to examine cemetery vandalism in the area, suspecting that extremist cells might be using desecrated graves as part of recruitment rituals or ideological demonstrations. They noted that many of the violated graves belonged to Muslims, and they began compiling lists of people in the region with detailed knowledge of cemetery locations. One name appeared repeatedly in their research: Anatoly Moskvin, the historian and cemetery expert who had documented over 700 burial grounds and who was known to virtually every gravedigger and caretaker in the region. On November 2, 2011, police knocked on the door of Moskvin's apartment. They had a warrant to search the premises, looking for evidence connecting him to the cemetery desecrations. They expected perhaps to find tools used in grave robbing, maybe some stolen items from gravestones, possibly extremist literature or materials. They were not prepared for what they actually found. The apartment was cluttered, packed floor to ceiling with books and papers and strange objects. And everywhere, positioned on shelves and sofas and tables, were the dolls. Large, life-sized figures dressed in colorful clothing, their faces painted or masked, their bodies posed in various positions as if they were simply resting or waiting. The investigators counted them as they moved through the apartment. 29 in total. Some wore wedding dresses, elaborate white gowns with veils trailing to the floor. Others wore simpler outfits, knee-high boots and frilly dresses. Many had makeup carefully applied to their faces. One of the investigators, perhaps by accident or perhaps out of curiosity, touched one of the dolls. It immediately began playing music, a tinkling melody from a music box hidden somewhere inside the body. The sound was eerie in the cluttered apartment, childlike and innocent but emanating from something that was clearly not what it appeared to be. Another investigator picked up one of the smaller dolls, perhaps to examine it more closely. The weight was wrong. The texture through the clothing was wrong. The smell, that sweet rotting smell that filled the apartment, suddenly made terrible sense. They began unwrapping the dolls, peeling away the layers of cloth and costume. What they found underneath defied belief. These were not dolls at all but mummified human remains, bodies that had been excavated from graves and transformed through preservation and decoration into macabre parodies of living children. The investigators, hardened men who had seen violence and death in many forms, were shocked into silence. One of them went outside to vomit. Another called for backup, his voice shaking as he tried to explain what they had discovered. They found other evidence throughout the apartment. Photographs of open graves and disturbed burial sites, videos showing excavations in progress, maps of local cemeteries with specific graves marked, instructions for mummification and doll making, printed from computers and annotated in Moskvin's neat handwriting. Plaques and nameplates removed from headstones, each one corresponding to one of the bodies. Hospital tags still attached to some of the corpses, listing cause of death and date of death. In one particularly horrifying detail, they found that one body still had a dried human heart stuffed inside its chest cavity, the organ preserved through desiccation like some grotesque relic. Moskvin's parents were home when the police arrived. When they realized what the dolls actually were, both Yuri and Elvira collapsed in shock. Elvira would later tell investigators that they had seen the dolls but never suspected they contained human remains. They thought it was simply Anatoly's hobby to make large dolls, something strange but harmless. They had lived with corpses in their apartment for years, had eaten meals with them nearby, had slept in the same space where their son kept mummified bodies of dead children. The psychological trauma of this realization was profound. Anatoly Moskvin himself was almost eager to cooperate with the investigation. He showed no shame or remorse, no understanding that what he had done was wrong. Instead, he seemed proud of his work, happy to finally have someone to show his creations to, someone who would appreciate the skill and care that had gone into preserving and transforming these bodies. He walked investigators through his process, explaining in detail how he had selected victims by reading obituaries, how he had established contact with spirits by sleeping on graves, how he had developed his mummification techniques through research and experimentation. He told them about waiting for the bodies to dry in secret locations, about carrying them home through the streets in bags, about the months of work required to transform each corpse into a doll. He explained his belief that science would eventually progress to the point where the dead could be resurrected, and that he was simply preserving these children until that day came. He showed investigators the music boxes he had embedded in some bodies, the button eyes he had sewn into faces, the hierarchies and relationships he had established among his collection. When asked about sexual motivation, Moskvin vehemently denied any such impulses. He insisted he had never touched the bodies inappropriately, had never viewed them as objects of sexual desire. They were his daughters, he said, his children whom he loved and cared for. The investigators found no evidence contradicting this claim, though whether this made his crimes better or worse was impossible to say. There was something almost more disturbing about the complete absence of sexual motivation, the pure focus on creation of a family through the desecration of graves. The victims' families were located and notified. Each body had to be identified, matched to missing persons reports and disturbed graves across the region. Some of the bodies had been in Moskvin's possession for nearly 9 years. The first girl he had taken, the one he kept longest and liked best, had been in his apartment since around 2002 or 2003. Her parents had mourned her loss twice now, once when she died and again when they learned what had been done to her remains. One mother, Natalia Chardamuva, spoke to media about her agony. Her daughter had been with Moskvin for 9 years, she said. She herself had only had her daughter for 10 years before death took her. The scope of Moskvin's work was difficult to comprehend. In total, Moskvin admitted to exhuming and desecrating at least 150 graves, though only 29 bodies were recovered from his apartment. What happened to the others remained unknown. Perhaps he had damaged them during excavation and left them behind. Perhaps some had decomposed too severely to be useful for his purposes. Perhaps he had hidden some in locations that were never discovered. The true scale of his activities would never be fully known. The case became international news, shocking people around the world with its bizarre and disturbing details. Russian media called him the Lord of the Mummies and the Perfumer, the latter nickname referencing Patrick Susskind's novel about a man who murders women to preserve their essence. Vladimir Stravinskas, head of the investigative committee of Russia for the Nizhny Novgorod region, called the case exceptional and unparalleled in modern forensics. Nothing like this had been encountered before in Russian criminal history. Moskvin was charged with multiple counts of desecration of graves and abuse of dead bodies under Article 244 of the Russian Criminal Code, charges that carried up to 5 years in prison. But the question of his criminal responsibility was complicated by obvious signs of mental illness. A psychiatric evaluation was ordered, and multiple experts examined Moskvin over several months. Their conclusion was unanimous. Moskvin suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, a severe mental illness that had likely been developing untreated for decades. He was not mentally fit to stand trial, could not be held fully responsible for his actions in the legal sense. In May 2012, rather than being sent to prison, Moskvin was sentenced to indefinite treatment at a psychiatric hospital. He was moved to a secure psychiatric facility where he would remain under observation and treatment, with his case reviewed regularly to determine if he had recovered sufficiently to either stand trial or be released. The families of his victims were outraged by this outcome. They wanted him in prison, wanted him punished for what he had done. The idea that he might someday be released, might walk free while their children remained forever dead, was unbearable to contemplate. Moskvin's treatment was extended repeatedly over the following years. In February 2013, a hearing approved continuation of his psychiatric care. The same thing happened in April 2014 and again in July 2015. Hospital officials stated that after 3 years of monitoring, it was absolutely clear that Moskvin was not mentally fit for trial and would therefore be kept for psychiatric treatment. But in September 2018, something changed. His doctors petitioned the court to release him for outpatient care from home, stating that he was no longer dangerous and could be managed with regular monitoring and medication. The families of his victims fought this petition desperately. Natalia Chartamova and other mothers whose daughters had been stolen and desecrated argued that Moskvin should spend the rest of his life in custody, that releasing him would be a betrayal of their children's memory. The psychiatric evaluation process dragged on for months. Finally, in February 2019, a new psychiatric examination concluded that it was too early to release Moskvin. He still exhibited signs of mental illness, still held beliefs that suggested he might repeat his actions if given the opportunity. The hospital withdrew their petition and Moskvin remained in custody. But perhaps the most chilling detail emerged during these proceedings. When warned by investigators that the bodies would be reburied after identification, Moskvin calmly told them not to bother. He said he would simply dig them up again once he was released. This wasn't a threat so much as a statement of fact in his mind, a logical conclusion to an interrupted project. He still believed the children had asked him to rescue them. He still believed he would one day find a way to bring them back to life. His years of treatment had not fundamentally changed his core beliefs or his sense that what he had done was good and necessary. As of the most recent reports, Moskvin remains in psychiatric custody. He is now in his late 50s, having spent more than a decade in treatment. Whether he will ever be released remains uncertain. The psychiatric system's determination that he poses no danger conflicts dramatically with his own statements suggesting he would immediately resume his activities. The families of his victims continue to advocate for his permanent confinement, arguing that their peace of mind and their children's dignity require that he never again walk free. The broader questions raised by Moskvin's case remain unresolved. How did a man carry out such activities for nearly a decade without detection? How did his parents live in the same apartment with 29 corpses and never realize what they were? What failures of the mental health system allowed his schizophrenia to progress untreated for so many years? How many other Anatoly Moskvins might exist in the world, brilliant but damaged individuals, whose obsessions drive them to unimaginable acts? The cemetery expert who knew 752 burial grounds better than anyone else, who could speak 13 languages and translate ancient Celtic texts, who had amassed a library of 60,000 books, had used all of his considerable intelligence and education to create a house of horrors. His story serves as a reminder that genius and madness are not opposites, but rather points on a spectrum, that the line between passionate interest and dangerous obsession can be terrifyingly thin, that the human mind is capable of constructing realities so divorced from consensus truth that they become incomprehensible to those outside them. In Nizhny Novgorod, families still visit graves that were once disturbed by Moskvin's nighttime excavations. They bring flowers and clean headstones and try not to think about what was done to their loved ones' remains. The city's cemeteries, once merely places of quiet remembrance, now carry a shadow of horror, a lingering dread that not even the dead are safe from violation. And in a psychiatric hospital somewhere in Russia, a man who believed he was saving children from loneliness sits in confinement, perhaps still dreaming of resurrection and return, of the day when science or magic will finally advance enough to bring his daughters back to life. The dolls themselves were destroyed after identification of the victims, cremated or buried again in sealed coffins that would be much harder to excavate. But the photographs remain in police files, evidence preserved for potential future proceedings. Images of life-sized figures in wedding dresses and colorful outfits, button eyes sewn into wax faces, bodies padded and stuffed to create the illusion of fullness. They are nightmare fuel, these photographs, impossible to unsee once witnessed, proof that reality can be more horrifying than any fiction. And somewhere in those same police files, There are maps marked with hundreds of graves, only 29 of which yielded bodies from Moskvin's apartment. The rest remain mysteries, disturbed graves whose occupants may have been taken and hidden in locations never discovered, or damaged during excavation and abandoned, or simply desecrated out of curiosity before Moskvin refined his methods. The full scope of what he did, the complete catalog of his decade-long project, will never be fully known. Some secrets die with the mind that held them, even when that mind continues to live in the confines of a psychiatric ward. This is the story of Anatoly Moskvin, the lord of the mummies, the cemetery expert who became a grave robber, the brilliant linguist who created a family from corpses. It is a story without redemption or resolution, a narrative that offers no comfort or meaning, only the stark acknowledgement that human beings are capable of acts that defy understanding, that beneath the veneer of civilization and rationality lurk depths of strangeness that challenge our fundamental assumptions about what it means to be human. In the end, perhaps that is the only lesson to be drawn from this nightmare, that we must remain vigilant, that we must watch for signs of darkness in ourselves and others, that we must never become so comfortable in our certainties that we forget how thin the ice beneath our feet truly is.